So this is a little bit about now. Diana's coming up on our radar pretty heavy.
So she went to DC. She was gone for 23 hours off our radar. Then she pops up with her phone calling Peggy the morning of the homicide. She called Peggy's house and left a message. And this, go back, go back. I apologize for the audio, it's really pretty pathetic. What that audio said basically was that, hey Peggy, don't tell me you're going into the city today. Maybe you're in the bathroom. Okay, call me. Now that becomes important because what I said before is that on her daily schedule, she had nothing planned for Saturday. She talked to her the day before 4 times. If you talk to somebody the day before 4 times, you're going to know what she's got going the next day. So that call was, to me, just another red flag. Like, why are you calling and making that such a big deal?
It was also 6 hours after the murder, so it was her trying to make it look like she didn't know anything was going on. She's calling to say hi to Peggy, even though anything was wrong. That Karen Ham number I gave was wrong. It was 177 times the girl bought the phone and Diana talked over 20 minutes. So here's the timeline. At 7:10 p.m. on the 23rd, that's the day before Diana flew up to Washington for the alleged wedding, Karen buys the track phone at the Family Dollar. On the 24th, Diana flew to Washington, D.C. at 6:40 a.m. At 9:35 a.m., we get the video of Andrea Benson picking her up in that Nissan Versa. Later on that night, at 8:17 p.m., the track phone that Karen bought in Miami was activated from the Baltimore, Maryland area by Andrea Benson's cell phone. And then at 9:03 p.m., both of those phones hit the cell tower at the entrance to the Jersey Turnpike northbound, and both were shut off. Got another signal from them until a couple hours later.
So that morning, the morning of the homicide at 1:17 a.m., that track phone that was bought down in Florida made a phone call, what we later determined was the driveway of 644 Andover Road, and called Peggy inside the house. And at 1:20, 3 minutes later after that phone call, Peggy's home alarm system went off. And then 3 minutes after that, Fullett Security, one of the local security companies here, called Peggy.
The phone call hit a tower at Jamons Park right in West Nyack. That's how we determined how close that phone was. Based on all those phone calls, this is a real quick summary of what we found out. At about 8 o'clock, Andrea Benson, and now we know with Diana in the car, headed up toward New York, up I-95. At 8:17, they actually tried a number of times. They couldn't figure out how to dial the proper numbers into the track phone. They pulled over into a service area, and from that location, they activated the track phone. We found that out by Andrea Benson's phone and the track phone popping off some towers. They then drove up the turnpike. At about 8:30, they were here, heading up toward Jersey. 8:40, they were here. And then right here, they entered the Jersey Turnpike. At 21:03 hours, both Andrea's telephone and the track phone cut off, turned off, powered down. After that, we were able to track them up just by knowing the time it took to get up and where they were, one of 2 different directions. We tried to get LPRs, license plate readers, we tried to get cameras from tolls. We weren't able to get anything in that regard from the time they turned the phones off to the time they get up to Valley College. When they made the phone call at 1:17 a.m., Peggy answered the phone.
So another crime scene type thing for the students. What does that bed tell you, besides the arrow that's pointing to the phone that she answered? Sleeping How many people were in the bed? One, right, that's important. That's a factor. That means she was alone in the bed, just by the way the covers are. There's little things you gotta look at a crime scene, and that's one of the elements. I'm not gonna bother playing the audio because it's tough to hear, but it's Peggy's voice at the bottom there when Bullet Security calls, and she says, "Everything is fine, my code word is Max," that's the name of the cat, and she goes, everything is fine, okay, okay, and she hangs up. She doesn't sound distressed, there is no panic in her voice, so that's another factor that made us believe that she knew the person that was with her. So she had no alarm in her voice, it wasn't like she was threatened. So that was just another reason why we knew that the surrounding area didn't have to worry about somebody running around with a knife stabbing old ladies.
More typical of the bad luck we were having all along. We talked to the alarm company and the owner of the alarm company who knew Peggy personally, and they said more than 50% of the time, when she sets the alarm off, she'll tell them why. "Oh, I'm sorry, I opened up the window without turning the alarm off. I'm sorry, I opened the sliding door without thinking." We were hoping this time she'd say, "I'm sorry, my daughter-in-law just walked in the front door." No such thing. That happened a lot.
And that's the next time you see Peggy, unfortunately,
After the fact.
after the fact.
So we got to,
So the lieutenant talked before, go ahead, sorry.
Or is it a
It's just the blown out picture. It's actually the flash kind of, there's other pictures, crime scene pictures that we have, where you can see where the knife blade was swiped out of the clothing and it wiped some of the blood off on one side, but the other side, on the flip side, has a lot of blood on it. It's just the nature of the picture there, the camera kind of caught it at an angle and blew out the blood, you can't really see it. Good question though. Great question. Lieutenant, you want to handle that?
There was another, I don't want to say it's a minor issue.
The question was, what was Peggy's time of death?
We had the medical examiner come in, and some of the other medical examiners we worked with in the past, it's a new medical examiner, actually takes a body temperature, and they either take a liver temperature, a lot of different means they're using. The people that came in, unfortunately, were not trained to do that. So when we got that information back from the medical examiner's office, we did not get a time of death. They did not give us a time of death, which could have been a huge factor if things didn't turn out the way they did turn out. That has since been corrected, and hopefully we'll not have that issue again. But that could have been a big factor.
But that was a great question because that could have obviously whittled down the time frame of the crime, and we could have excluded Suzanne rather quickly if we had that information, but we didn't, so we couldn't. So the lieutenant said before about there was a lot of moving parts in this thing, a lot of detectives involved in this thing, every detective involved in this thing, from other agencies as well in Rockland. And we had people all over the county interviewing different people. Suzanne would tell us, in the beginning, she was telling us who she thought might do it. The landscaper, the maid, they had a couple of maids, housekeepers, the contractors. Peggy just had a bathroom redone in her house, so she had contractors in and out of her house just within the past week prior to the homicide. The caller ID, which we checked, obviously. The boyfriend, there was a couple of men that she had lunch with, platonic, it was nothing further than that. And then Diana obviously had something to do with it, Suzanne had something to do with it, so that's kind of where we were going with this. Suspect pool, Karen Ann Samuel bought the track phone. Diana Nadell lives a mile away from where the track phone was purchased, talks to Karen Ann Samuel every day. That track phone activated by Andrea Benson. And Suzanne Nadell is still active as a suspect in this investigation. Still, even though she's becoming less and less, she's still there. Okay?
At one point, one of the theories was maybe Diane and Suzanne were together on this because it's $4.5 million. They each split it if something would happen. A couple other people that started to get involved in this. There's a niece of Diana, Althea Grant, who was also the half-sister of Andrea Benson. She had a ton of phone calls to Jamaica, to Lanai, the ex-husband of Diana, and to Diana, and to Andrea, and to this young lady, Tanisha. This is Andrea Benson's best friend. She turns out supplied one of the alibis. What happened was, as Diana laid this whole thing out, Diana knew the cops were going to start looking at telephones. So Diana took her telephone and ran it over to Tanisha's house at about 10 o'clock that night, 9 o'clock that night, right before they left for New York, and gave her instructions on what to do with it. So Diana's phone stayed in Washington and made phone calls and texts throughout the whole entire time of the murder, including a phone call to Karen Ham Samuel, who was one of her best friends. So the calls that were made were not extraordinary. They would have been normal calls. And of course, when we interviewed her, she wanted us to just check her phone because she stayed in Washington all the time.
She kept saying, check the towers, check the towers. It'll show you that I was in D.C. It'll show you. You just check the towers. And sure enough, we checked, and yeah, the phone was in D.C., no doubt. She wasn't lying
She did
about
a lot of
that.
homework. One thing was not on a slide. This is what the conspiracy ended up looking like. Murder was up in New York. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go.
Murder was up in New York. We started following phone calls. We had phone calls from this same group of people: Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, California, Miami, and Jamaica. It was just a network, a mess. We had dozens upon dozens of spreadsheets showing all of these phone calls and connections. What it all boiled down to was what we went over already. Karen Ham Samuel bought the phone in Miami. Diana flew to Washington. Andrea picked up Diana. Althea Grant in California turned out to be the connection. She was the one who communicated all of this because she was in California. Nobody suspected the person in California. So she communicated all this to all the players, including the one who was kind of running the whole chess game, which was Menai out in Jamaica through Althea.
Well, as far as this goes, this conspiracy, as I told you, went everywhere. It went to Jamaica, went to California, D.C., Florida, with a crime actually occurring in New York. We've never seen anything like that up here before. I've never heard of another case like that where it literally involves so many people. And as they're going to get to, frankly, that's what got them caught. Okay, there were so many people involved in this, little different parts, and frankly, not everyone knew everything, which we learned later on. Althea Grant knew some pieces. Tanisha Joyner knew some pieces. Karen Ham Samuel knew some. Andrea Benson knew some. The only person that knew everything in this case was Diana Nadell.
So for the first time that we know of in Rockland County, because it wasn't just a homicide, we wanted to get an electronic wire. We wanted to go up on some telephones to make sure we were putting this together right. Well, normally you go up on a telephone, electronic wiretap, with a drug case, some kind of an ongoing event. Well, what we did through the DA's office in Rich, we determined that not only was there a murder, but there was an ongoing criminal conspiracy to cover up the murder. And because it was an ongoing crime, we were able to go up eventually on 4 wiretaps. So we had a wiretap in a homicide case. We went up on Diana's phone. We went up on Diana's 12-year-old son's phone, who she used to make most of the phone calls. We went up on Karen Ham Samuel's phone, and eventually up on Andrea Benson's.
This was something we frankly didn't even know if we could do at first. We had spoken about it pretty early on in the case. As soon as Diana Nadell became somebody we were looking at, a wiretap in this case would be perfect. The problem is the crime's already committed. Most of the times you do a wiretap is with an ongoing investigation. People are selling drugs, they're part of a gang, they're committing crimes on a daily basis. This was a wiretap specifically involving acts taking place after the crime was already committed. And we did it under the theory, which none of us had ever, we don't think anyone else had ever done it before, under the theory that it's a continuing conspiracy to cover up the crime that was committed. We sat for hours putting it together, days actually, and we got it to a judge. I brought both sergeants with me. We sat with the judge. He read the wiretap application, had a few questions, and he said, well, I'm not going to stand in your way. Signed the wiretap, and I would tell you as the prosecutor on the case that the two main reasons we have convictions in this case are the use of the track phone and the wiretap. The wiretap became huge, and I'll talk about that a little more when we talk about the prosecution of the case.
Okay, just so you know what we ended up doing, we had, when I say dozens and dozens of pages of spreadsheets, we did every one of those telephones mechanically. We entered them into spreadsheets, we color-coded them, the blocks looked like a rainbow. What we ultimately ended up doing after we laid all that out, we gave a call over to Westchester Intel and developed a very good friendship with them. And we said, okay, we've done this, but we really want to look at everything to make sure we're not missing anything. So they dumped it into their system. That is an analysis of over 500,000 calls and text messages. And basically what they've done is they've given us a pattern here, and the pattern fell right in line with the spreadsheets that we had done. So we now have the capability of doing this. Learned a lot from this case, actually started immediately as a result of this case. And now we do this regularly.
One more thing. That's how we got the wiretap. Normally, when you're in law enforcement, you know, to get a wiretap, you need something called a dirty call or a dirty text message, something that directly implicates this phone or these phones are being used to commit crimes, or in our case, to cover up crimes. Here we had none of that. We literally just had call patterns, pure technology, pure numbers, call patterns, and based upon those call patterns, we were able to develop probable cause to say to the judge, based upon the patterns before the homicide, during, and after, there's probable cause to believe these phones are used to commit the crime and now is still being used to cover up the crime.
Okay, so Diana, when she was pinned into a corner trying to set up where exactly were you, now she's not like in Suffern where I can just go knock on her door and talk to her. Everything was done via text, email, over the phone. She'd call us periodically, so she was still cooperating to a degree ongoing. So that was good. We thought that was very good. But she was pinned into a corner and asked exactly her exact whereabouts in D.C. She really hemmed and hawed. So she asked again where she was and where her husband was. Her husband mentioned a couple of people, a co-worker and a neighbor who saw him down there. He was verified within 15 minutes, his whereabouts. Her, so that's a problem for Diana.
Now this happened 3 times. There were 2 other alibis that she gave us. She blamed us for not being clear enough as to what we wanted. One of the beauties of this was, by this time, we were now up on these wires. So we were listening to her on the wiretaps, calling each of these 3 alibis. You have to tell them when they call where I was, that I was with you. The very first alibi, she was so confused. She said, as we're listening, you were at my house from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m.? No, no, no. Tell the truth. I was at your house from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. the next day. So we had all that coming in. So then we'd go into the other room, call up Diana, and she'd give us the story that we just heard. So we really had this tight now as it started to come down.
So this is her second alibi. After the Dawn Swaby said, no, I didn't see her that at all, so I can't supply any alibi for her. Diana then supplies alibi number 2, which is Karen Parker, which is, she was, if you remember, the reason why she was in D.C. to even begin with was to go to a wedding. This was the mother of the bride of the wedding she was supposed to attend in D.C. Turns out that the only communication between Diana and Karen Parker, the mother of the bride in D.C., was when Diana sent her a text message saying that she's here in D.C. At no time, at no point ever did she communicate verbally over the phone with her or see her in person. And she told us that. So alibi number 1 is shot down. Her second alibi number 2 is shot down. I think she's going to try to make it a trifecta. Okay. So, like Steve said, she said that we were not very specific in our request for where she was. She goes, you weren't specific enough in telling me what you wanted. I don't know, I think it's pretty specific when you ask somebody for their alibi where they were, but for her, that wasn't specific enough. So now she said, now that you want to know that, where I stayed the night, I stayed with Tanisha Joyner, and she's going to be alibi number 3. Go ahead.
Was it ever verified if there was actually a wedding or?
There was a wedding,
Okay.
and that is actually a picture from the wedding,
Okay.
found on open source media.
And she told us that Diana wasn't really invited. She called up and invited herself. She needed a reason to
She
get.
needed a reason to go to DC so she can get to New York to kill Peggy.
Now, this third alibi, Tanisha Joyner, she's the one that got really confused and didn't know which truth she was supposed to tell us. Now, we're listening to all this on the Wiretap, and then minutes later, we call her up.
Just to add one thing on the wiretap, what we found interesting was that Diana's was obviously, you can see she was so scared of technology. She would occasionally do what I was calling talk to the wire, meaning she would say to Tanisha, no, Tanisha Joyner, she was the best. She says, wait, I was with you from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. or 9 a.m. to 6 p.m.? And Diana says, no, tell the truth. You were with me from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. So Diana's talking, thinking she might actually be on the wire, even though we know it's not true because we heard all her other calls. We ended up on what, four phones. I was actually down visiting my mother in Myrtle Beach overnight, literally writing a wiretap on her veranda, so I can get it to these guys the next day to get signed, because we started learning that different people were using phones and whatnot. It got pretty crazy. But that was interesting to see her actually talking, that she didn't know we were on the wiretap because she's saying a lot of dumb stuff, but she thought we might be. So every once in a while you hear her talk as if, she thinks we're listening.
When we went up on her 12-year-old son's wire, that was just terrific, because she'd call somebody and say, call me on the other phone. She'd hang up the phone, and then we'd go to the next computer, and we'd hear the call where she was calling her on the son's phone, and we'd hear the
And she would yell at her son, 12-year-old son, she would yell at her son, why aren't you home yet? I need you to be home. And the only reason she wanted him home is to use his phone.
He wanted to stay after for religious training, right? He wanted to stay after school to learn about religion. She said, no, get home now, because she had to make a phone call.
She had to make a phone call because the pressure was getting too much for her. Anyway, as far as Karen Parker goes, she also was a little savvy, and she said, should we even be talking on your phone? So that raised a little red flag, but at the time, she knew enough to say, I'm not supplying you with any alibi information, so that worked out good for her. Unfortunately, Tanisha Joyner, of all the people involved in this, we kind of all agree that we feel badly for her. She's kind of didn't have a lot of good things to start out in her life or continue on in her life. She's not the most bright individual. She was taken advantage of, used in this case, by Diana. Diana used everybody that she came across, and she used her as well. And got dragged in.
This was a very poverty-stricken area in Washington where Diana abused all these people. Andrea Benson, who came up, she was given $500 to commit this murder with a promise of another $9,500 when things cooled down. So that was life-changing money for these people. It was really very poverty-stricken. Does this work?
It doesn't.
This is the one where it's hilarious, where she's trying to get the truth straightened out.
There are a few times that we called her to try to get an alibi, and she was just very confused. She didn't know the times. She didn't know what she was really supposed to say. And we actually tried to give her an out the last time we talked to her. We're like, we don't want to see you get involved in something that you don't want to really, you had nothing to do with, so really this is not good for you to be involved in this. And she was like, no, from 9 to 6, 9 to 6. Like, okay. So then we started, Diana got nervous. Diana got nervous and saying, she's not going, Tanisha's not giving the alibi like I told her. So then she called Andrea Benson and said, listen, she's got to go with the program. And then Andrea Benson said, if that's what you told her to say, that's what she's going to do. And she goes, I know, I'm in it too, so I know. So Diana then says, make sure you tell her 9 to 6, 9 p.m., because before she had told us 9 a.m. So she was all over the map. And she said to her, if you have to use someone else's phone to make the call, do it, I don't care. Why would you have to do that? Nothing, no big deal.
Diana got very desperate. After a while, she started threatening Andrea and some of the other people, saying, listen, I'm not going down alone. I'm going to take everybody. You have to do this. So it started getting juicy toward the end.
And she was under a tremendous amount of pressure from us and family members. And right prior to the homicide, she had lost like 50 pounds because she was trying to get back together with the ex. After this homicide, she gained the 50 pounds plus another 25. So she was eating her feelings.
For the arrest. The motive we talked about, there was a dispute in 2012 with Diana and her husband, Jim, and son, and Peggy, about how the estate was going to be distributed. Diana was under the misimpression that the minute Peggy was dead, everything was accessible to her.
So there was ongoing red flags with Diana Nadell. The more red flags came up with her, the less kind of Suzanne got pushed into the background. We still thought maybe there was a possibility that they were working together and she'd get a portion of the estate from the homicide, but that became less and less of a factor going forward. But with Diana Nadell, she's setting up these fake alibis. Jim Nadell told a family member that just a couple of months prior to the homicide that he didn't love Diana anymore and he wanted a divorce. So there was ongoing marital strife, and there was this constant Diana holding back the grandchildren. They used to visit Peggy every year, a couple of times a year. And for 2 years prior to the homicide, they would hold back the grandchildren for money, for financial assistance. Diana would. And then she twisted and make it seem like she was the victim. But
Peggy Nadell would send Diana thousands and thousands of dollars for the kids.
to the point where she actually paid for everybody's cell phone in the family. Crazy. Guy's a
So they could call.
55-year-old doctor in Florida, and his cell phone bill is paid for by mom.
We started digging through a lot of paperwork through the house and through the things that we collected. And during this 2012 exchange with Jim Nadell, Peggy, and Diana involved, we found this.
Yeah, this was actually in the front of her estate binder. She had an estate binder. So with $4 million, you can imagine that you'd have some people looking after items for you, a financial advisor, etc. So she had a leather-bound binder, and in the front of that leather-bound binder, you open it up, and this was an email from Jim to Peggy, to mom, saying, you know, these are the changes I'd like you to make to the estate. You know, basically trying to include Diana, that she would get some of the interest even if we get divorced. So on the next slide, you'll see she writes handwritten notes. If you go from, sorry, go back. So if you see on the bottom of that, that's an email from Jim to Peggy, but on the bottom, Peggy's meticulous. She writes down everything. So she wrote down on the bottom there in black, if Jim and Diana divorce before I die, she can't get any of Jim's trust income as alimony. But if after I die, she can.
So remember, in October, Jim told a cousin that he no longer loves Diana and doesn't want to be married to her anymore. She knows that if Jim and Diana are divorced before Peggy dies, she doesn't get anything. 3 months later, before any divorce or matrimonial problems, Peggy is dead.
So a lot of moving parts to this thing. We finally had enough after the wire and everything else. We had what we thought was enough to go down there and have a plan of attack. And I wish we could play the video from him screaming in exuberance when we were speaking to Karen Ham Samuel, who said that that phone call that she was making that supplied the alibi for Diana was a fake phone call.
Even though we had 4 teams out, we had a team in California, 2 teams in Washington and Baltimore, the headquarters operations center being run by the lieutenant, and us down in Miami. The district attorney still said we need just one more thing to clinch it. So what we did was we had everybody on standby, and we wanted to pick up Karen Ham Samuels first, see if we could get her to break. So we ended up tailing her in Miami. We had a blast. We tailed her for about an hour in Miami with U.S. Marshals. She had her husband with her. We wanted her completely alone so nobody could make any phone calls. When she finally dropped her husband off at work, we just all swooped in, grabbed her, brought her into Miami-Dade homicide. And we were looking for that little clincher. And finally, when she admitted, yeah, I got that phone call at 1 o'clock in the morning, it wasn't Diana. 4 blocks down the hallway We can hear the.
That's it, we got it.
So that's when we knew we were going to be able to.
And she
pull the
identified
trigger.
her on the, she identified herself as being the one that purchased the track phone on the video, and she said that she gave that phone to Diana Nadell, so those are huge pieces of this puzzle. And that's her in the interview room. Unfortunately, it doesn't basically tells you what, we just told you what she said.
This is where she finally admitted that it wasn't Diana on the phone. And then you can hear the assistant district attorney work for her in the background.
That aside, the reason strategically we picked her was because we had, thanks for that, we had the best evidence was against her so far. She purchased a phone that was used in a homicide. So you take the person you have the best case against because they're most likely to, what I call flip. They're most likely to, break down and, and give you everything you need because you have a solid case against her. We could show her a video of her purchasing a phone that a day later was used in a murder. So we knew she'd tell us something, and she did, and we were happy and expressed it verbally and loudly.
And unfortunately, you can see,
If we could play this, when we walked in, we hadn't seen her in a couple of months, and we walked in, the first thing she said was, "You think I killed my mother-in-law?" And Earl said, "Well, do you know who we are?" She said, "Yes, you're Earl and T." That's what she called us. And it wasn't long after this that she pretty much knew that we had it. So,
she was doing her gardening that day, laying out sod in her front lawn. And she said when nobody else was in the room, it was being monitored, she goes, "I picked some day to get caught. I got dirt under my nails and everything." She's worried about her nails.
here's the four that ended up being arrested. That's Diana, Andrea Benson, Tanisha Joyner, Althea Grant, so California, Baltimore area, Washington, D.C., Miami. And it looks like the